It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of prosperity. It was the age of austerity. It was the epoch of Wall Street. It was the epoch of breadlines. It was the season of Silicon Valley. It was the season of closed factories. It was the spring of the internet. It was the winter of ration cards. In the gilded halls of Harvard, the drumbeat of neoliberalism was a sonorous anthem, echoing through corridors of power and into the heart of a brave new digital world. The American dream, refracted through the prism of unbridled capitalism, was taking flight in the silicon-etched landscape of the West, promising prosperity and progress. Yet across the vast ocean, beneath the watchful gaze of the Russian bear, a different symphony was being orchestrated. The fall of the Iron Curtain and subsequent privatization had given birth not to orderly lines of democracy and free market, but to the brutal ballet of oligarchs and the mafia. What the 90s would bring to Russia was not a taste of the American dream, but the beginning of the Russian nightmare. Winston Churchill famously characterized Russia as a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. The story of modern Russia is complex and doesn't have a happy ending, but it's not as incomprehensible as one might think. To understand a nation, you need to understand its history, Russians being no exception. The groundwork for contemporary Russia was laid in the 1980s. As oil prices tumbled, the economy of the Soviet Union, heavily dependent on energy exports, started to unravel. The country's economic strategy, characterized by an excessive investment in raw material extraction and the military-industrial complex, led to a period of relative stagnation, particularly when compared to the West. Confronted with an ever-widening economic chasm, the Soviet Politburo came to the realization that drastic changes were not just desirable, but imperative. Thus, the stage was set for a tumultuous transition, the echoes of which continue to reverberate in the actions of modern Russia. First came perestroika and glasnost, two policies which were revolutionary reform initiatives, launched by the then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in the mid-1980s, as part of a broader strategy to revive the stagnating Soviet economy and political system.
Well, it's been 14 years in the making, and today, finally, McDonald's threw open the doors to its first restaurant in Moscow.
Perestroika, which means restructuring in Russian, was an economic policy aimed at liberalizing the Soviet economy. Gorbachev believed that the USSR's centrally planned economy, characterized by its strict government control over all aspects of production and distribution, was stifling innovation and productivity. Under perestroika, limited free market mechanisms were introduced, and state enterprises were given a degree of autonomy. The intent was to incentivize productivity and efficiency, and encourage innovation by making enterprises more accountable for their profits and losses. Glasnost, meaning openness, was a political and social policy aimed at increasing transparency and freedom of speech within the USSR. Under Glasnost, media censorship was relaxed, and public criticism of the government, which was previously heavily suppressed, was allowed. Gorbachev's intention was to create a platform for open dialogue and debate, enabling the exposure and rectification of the state's past and present mistakes. However, these policies had unintended consequences. The partial liberalization under perestroika exposed the deep-rooted inefficiencies of the Soviet economic system without providing an immediate viable alternative. This led to economic instability, shortages, and a decline in living standards for many Soviet citizens. Simultaneously, Glasnost's political openness unearthed a multitude of social and political issues that had been brewing under the surface. The policy led to a surge in nationalist and separatist movements within the numerous Soviet republics as suppressed grievances came to the fore. The liberalization of the media also exposed the corruption and inefficiencies of the Soviet system, leading to widespread disillusionment among the populace. These combined factors fostered a climate of instability and discontent. As economic conditions worsened and nationalist movements gained momentum, the unity of the Soviet Union began to fracture. The very policies that were designed to strengthen the Soviet Union ended up accelerating its decline, culminating in its eventual dissolution in 1991. In an ironic twist, perestroika and glasnost, instead of rejuvenating the Soviet Union, contributed significantly to its collapse. As the final curtain fell on the USSR, Boris Yeltsin, a pivotal actor in the revolution against communism, faced the daunting task of steering Russia from the familiar realm of a command economy towards the uncharted waters of market capitalism. His charismatic leadership and confrontational style resulted in a series of confrontations with the communist old guard, culminating in the events of August 1991, where he famously stood atop a tank in defiance of a coup attempt.
1991 года отстранен от власти законно избранный президент страны.
The transition from the Soviet command and control economy to a market economy posed significant challenges. The Soviet system had for decades been characterized by state ownership of resources and central planning, with prices and production quotas set by the government. Shifting to a market economy meant allowing prices to be determined by supply and demand, and promoting competition and entrepreneurship. Two Russian economists, Yegor Gaidar and Anatoly Chubais, played pivotal roles in this economic transition. Gaidar as acting prime minister and Chubais as an economic advisor and later minister of finance were tasked with the daunting responsibility of creating a market economy from the remnants of Soviet communism. Gaidar and Chubais initially preferred a gradual transition towards a market economy. This approach was based on the notion that such a monumental economic shift couldn't be accomplished overnight without causing massive social and economic upheaval. They aimed to carefully manage the pace of reform to avoid undue hardship and instability. However, they quickly realized that a successful transition required more than just economic reforms. It required the establishment of solid institutions, such as independent courts, functioning capital markets, and strong regulatory bodies. These institutions are vital to ensuring a fair, transparent, and efficient market economy, and they were largely absent in the Soviet system. Despite the initial preference for a gradual transition, the urgent circumstances led Yeltsin and his economic team to adopt a more radical approach, often referred to as shock therapy. Yeltsin's urgency was driven by a fear of time running out. The attempted coup in August 1991 and resistance from Soviet industrialists who benefited from the status quo heightened his concerns about the sustainability of gradual reforms. The concept of shock therapy entailed a rapid transition to a market economy by quickly unleashing market forces. The aim was to ensure the complete eradication of the old Soviet system, thereby preventing any chance of a return to communism. This strategy involved measures such as immediate price liberalization, rapid privatization of state-owned enterprises, and the introduction of a convertible currency. The strategy of shock therapy was strongly supported by American advisors and global creditors, particularly the International Monetary Fund, IMF. They believed that a swift and decisive transition would quickly stabilize the Russian economy and foster growth. Jeffrey Sachs, a prominent American economist, proposed a substantial aid package and debt cancellation for Russia to cushion the impact of the economic shock. He argued that this approach would facilitate a smoother transition and prevent the emergence of extreme hardship and potential social unrest. However, Sachs's proposal was not well received by American leaders. The post-Cold War era was characterized by a sense of triumphalism in the West, and there was little appetite for a massive financial commitment to Russia. This lack of support arguably contributed to the hardships and economic turmoil that characterized Russia's transition, illustrating the significant role that international factors can play in a country's domestic economic trajectory. He envisaged a $30 billion aid package from the United States and multilateral development agencies, an initiative echoing the post-World War II Marshall Plan. Furthermore, Sachs proposed a complete write-off of Russia's debts. Regrettably, these proposals fell on deaf ears among American policymakers. The first major economic reform implemented by Yeltsin was the removal of price controls in December 1991. The move, while radical, was intended to stimulate competition and free market dynamics. However, it instead triggered an era of unprecedented hyperinflation. Ordinary Russian citizens found the prices of everyday goods skyrocketing almost overnight. The candy bar that once cost a ruble suddenly became a luxury item, with prices rising exponentially. The economic shock led to widespread hardship, as ordinary Russians struggled to afford basic necessities. The rate of inflation in Russia was so high during this period that prices could change multiple times throughout the day. It wasn't uncommon for restaurants to revise their menu prices during meal service, or for shoppers to see the price of an item go up while they were still in the store. At its peak in 1992, the inflation rate was nearly 2,500%. As the ruble became increasingly worthless, many Russians began to prefer holding and trading in stable foreign currencies, particularly the US dollar. This phenomenon, known as dollarization, was so widespread that some businesses and landlords would only accept payments in dollars.
Настроения у всех ужасные. Огромное количество людей теряет работу, теряет контракты. Например, один из знакомых, у него было сбережений $800 тысяч. К вечеру у него осталась 1 000, которая у него была наличными.
Making matters worse, savings accounts became virtually worthless overnight. Many ordinary Russians who had worked and saved their whole lives suddenly found that their life savings couldn't buy more than a few household items. This situation led to a lack of trust in the banking system that persists to some extent even today. Simultaneously, Yeltsin was faced with the colossal task of mass privatization. The entire Russian economy, comprising manufacturing plants, oil refineries, mines, and media outlets, among other state-controlled industries, had to be transformed into private enterprises. It was an endeavor of epic proportions, considered the most significant transfer of state assets to private ownership in world history. The privatization process was carried out in 2 waves. The first wave began in October 1992. To facilitate the transition, the government issued privatization checks or vouchers to Russian citizens. These vouchers could be freely sold or traded, and could then be used to buy shares of state enterprises going private at public auctions across the nation. Amid this backdrop of national transformation, a new class of opportunistic individuals began to emerge. These soon-to-be oligarchs, who had built wealth during the late 1980s through black market hustling or legitimate businesses, saw an opportunity to increase their fortunes. They embarked on a quest to acquire as many privatization vouchers as possible. One such individual was Roman Abramovich. Before the era of privatization, Abramovich was a modest entrepreneur, making his first foray into business by selling rubber ducks and other random objects from his Moscow apartment. He also worked as a mechanic. However, by the time of privatization, Abramovich had ascended to the ranks of the wealthy, owning a bank and possessing enough resources to buy a substantial number of vouchers. Abramovich's story exemplifies the meteoric rise of the oligarchs during this period of economic upheaval. As these individuals capitalized on the opportunities presented by the transition to a market economy, they amassed staggering wealth and power. Their emergence marked a new chapter in Russia's economic history, one characterized by the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a select few. Thus, the dramatic economic reforms of the early 1990s, initiated by Yeltsin, not only transformed Russia's economy, but also reshaped its social and political landscape, giving rise to the oligarchs and setting the stage for the challenges that Russia continues to grapple with today.
On television, Russians watch part of an $8 million public relations campaign paid for by the U.S. government.
Nothing has been lost. You may invest your voucher in any city in Russia without leaving Moscow. A bus will take you from the metro station to the Moscow auction center. Call and come.
The oligarchs embarked on a buying spree during the privatization drive initiated by the Yeltsin administration. The Russian government issued vouchers, each worth about 10,000 rubles to every Russian citizen. These vouchers could be used to purchase shares in newly privatized companies. The oligarchs, through various strategies, managed to acquire hundreds of thousands of these vouchers and used them to buy stakes in undervalued enterprises. By 1994, about 70% of the Russian economy was privatized, with many oligarchs becoming extraordinarily wealthy in a short span of time. The emergence of these new billionaires is all the more impressive given the fact that as recently as 1987, anyone in Russia engaging in private business risked arrest for committing an economic crime. However, the privatization drive did not go unhindered. Political obstacles and public discontent with privatization disrupted the process, leaving some of the most valuable industries in state hands. Amid the chaos, Yeltsin's popularity was dwindling, and the specter of a communist resurgence loomed. It was in this context that the Yeltsin administration turned to a controversial scheme known as loans for shares. The scheme involved the oligarchs lending money to the cash-strapped government in exchange for temporary shares in state enterprises. The aim was twofold: to keep the privatization drive alive and to secure oligarch support for Yeltsin's re-election. When the government defaulted on the loans, the oligarchs would take permanent control of the enterprises. In 1995, 12 of Russia's most profitable enterprises were auctioned off as part of this scheme. The auctions, however, were a farce, with the allocation of enterprises to the oligarchs predetermined. A notable example was the acquisition of a large stake in the oil company Sibneft by oligarchs Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich for about $200 million, a fraction of its worth. David Hoffman, the former Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post, described the loans for shares scheme as a covert bid to secure oligarch support for Yeltsin's re-election. The oligarchs, in return for their support, were promised the continuation of privatization under Yeltsin's administration. The 1996 presidential election in Russia was a turning point in the country's political landscape. It was during this period that the newly formed oligarchy, individuals who had accumulated vast wealth through the privatization of state assets, rallied behind the incumbent President Boris Yeltsin. Their motivation was simple: to guarantee the continuity of the political and economic climate that had facilitated their newfound wealth. Financial support was a key aspect of the oligarchs' contribution to Yeltsin's re-election campaign. The campaign at the time was desperately in need of funds, struggling to keep up with the Communist Party's well-resourced efforts. The oligarchs filled this financial vacuum, providing millions of dollars that were then used to hire top-tier political consultants, including American experts who revolutionized the campaign with modern strategies such as focus groups and televised advertising. The oligarchs' control over major media outlets also played a significant role in Yeltsin's election success. They owned most of the national television networks and numerous significant newspapers, all of which were used as platforms to paint Yeltsin in a favorable light, while often casting his opponents, especially communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov, in a negative one. Beyond the realms of finance and media, the oligarchs utilized their considerable political clout to bolster support for Yeltsin. They reached out to their extensive networks, lobbied political elites, and even leveraged international connections to garner foreign endorsements for Yeltsin.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I came here as a friend and supporter of the democratic changes going on in this country. I hope that together we can make a positive difference in a genuine and equal partnership.
The concerted maneuvers of the oligarchs effectively turned the tables in Yeltsin's favor, cementing his re-election. This victory not only perpetuated but also safeguarded the economic strategies that had facilitated the staggering accumulation of wealth by these oligarchs. Following the election, Boris Berezovsky, a notorious oligarch, boldly proclaimed that he and 6 others held the reins of half the Russian economy. These so-called semi-bankirshina, Russian for 7 bankers, had extracted billions from the rich veins of Mother Russia. Yet what did they return to her? A ferocious inflation rate that peaked at a staggering 2,500% in 1992, a crushing poverty rate that had ensnared nearly 40% of the population by the mid-90s, a chilling homicide rate that hovered around 30 per 100,000, an economy that had shrunk alarmingly, contracting by nearly 40% over the decade, a life expectancy that had plummeted to a low of 57 years for men and 71 for women in 1994. The emergence of this new power class of oligarchs was met with growing public resentment. Their fortunes were not built on innovative ideas, superior products, or technological advancements, but rather on the manipulation of a privatization scheme that was intended to democratize wealth. The oligarchs, along with the liberal reformers who had facilitated their rise, quickly became the focus of public ire. The cynicism harbored by Russians towards democracy, liberalism, and particularly American neoliberal institutions is hardly surprising, considering the tumultuous experience during their lost decade. This disillusionment is not restricted to Russians alone. Several economic advisors who advocated shock therapy and rapid liberalization hailed from Harvard University. In 2005, these individuals, along with Harvard itself, were implicated in a lawsuit filed by the U.S. Justice Department. The defendants, including the president and fellows of Harvard College, Andrei Schleifer, Jonathan Hay, Nancy Zimmerman, and Elizabeth Hebert, were accused of exploiting their advisory roles during Russia's transition to a market economy in the 1990s. Funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, Schleifer and Hay were accused of leveraging their influence to invest in the Russian securities market, which they were concurrently designing and regulating. Zimmerman and Hebert were also implicated, as it was alleged they capitalized on insider information. The lawsuit culminated in 2005 with a settlement wherein Harvard University, Schleifer and Zimmerman agreed to pay $31 million to the US government. And if you think a dime of that money made it back to the Russian people, well, you haven't been paying attention. Regardless, as Yeltsin's health deteriorated towards the end of the 1990s, the oligarchs grew anxious about his succession. The Prime Minister's role became a focus of their concern, as it was understood that the Prime Minister would become acting president should Yeltsin step down. This concern led to the emergence of an unlikely figure, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer. Selected as Prime Minister by Yeltsin and his allies, Putin was viewed as a loyal subordinate who would protect the interests of the oligarchs. This, however, turned out to be a severe miscalculation. Once in power, Putin proved to be a formidable leader with his own agenda, and he was not as pliable as the oligarchs had hoped.
ОРТ продолжает знакомить вас с главными событиями дня. Количество погибших в результате взрыва дома на Каширском шоссе сегодня достигло 121 человека. Среди погибших 12 детей.
Многие представители спецслужб, которые сейчас работают на месте происшествия, практически не сомневаются в том, что это был теракт.
I told you back in the beginning, this story doesn't have a happy ending. No one who went through it, even the survivors, came out intact. What happened in Russia in the early 90s was just the beginning, the last chance to save a wounded nation before it descends into darkness. It was that moment when the hope of integrating Russia into the West fell apart.
What America is officially calling a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russian troops spreading out throughout the strategic Crimean Peninsula.
What happened during shock therapy gave birth to the first oligarchs. And from that, others would follow. And the mafia and political assassinations and war, they'd just keep coming. It would change the rest of the world eventually. Maybe we should have woken up sooner, I don't know. But it's where the first domino fell. The one that would lead to the largest land war in Europe since World War II. And after that, none of it would be the same. How could it be? This has been another episode of Meridian Mindset. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment down below. We also just launched a new Twitter account, so please give us a follow at Meridian Mindset and check out our other socials as well.